and thanks for watching this Life Solve video. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers who are sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solve podcast. Now, this is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. With a new year here, many of us are trying to stick to our resolutions, and whether it's cutting down on coffee or chocolate, it's often the smell of things we crave that sends us over the edge. I'm joined by Dr. Lorenzo Stafford, who's Associate Professor in Psychobiological Psychology here at the University of Portsmouth. What a great title. Together we'll take a look at this rare area of research, how a smell can trigger intense emotions, the challenges of not having a language for aromas, and why we should take smell more seriously. So Lorenzo, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
So let's start with the title, I think, because that's probably one of the most unique titles I've come across recording this series. What led you into this area of research? What was it about smells that drew you in?
Right. Well, I think just sort of growing up sort of in the 1970s in London, and my mother was Italian, and so exposed to like a wide variety of different sort of smells and foods and what have you in the household. And I think one of my earliest memories was like coffee, like freshly brewed coffee, one of those old-fashioned Bialetti kind of coffee stoves in our small kitchen in London, and just the aroma kind of filling the air, that rich sort of smell, and got many kind of fond memories associated to that time. And I think it's just sort of like that's one of my earliest memories, but obviously lots of food type ones as well. My mother was a good cook. So I think it must have like planted a seed, I think, in my mind that, you know, the importance of smells. And then many years later, when I had the opportunity to kind of think more about it, then I think that must have, resurrected itself, if you like, then, yeah. So that was probably one of the things. And, so that's one of the earliest memories, I guess.
And coffee for me is a bit of a strange one because I never really enjoyed the smell of coffee, but I liked the feeling of it, I suppose, the kind of the alertness that came with it. And you find that with children, because you mentioned you were quite young when you first were introduced to the smell of coffee. Do you remember ever disliking it, or was it sort of associated to that memory?
I think it associates that memory in the good times, I think, as well. You know, we know from sort of odours and memory, they play a very powerful role in sort of like memories, and we're able to kind of, you know, when we're reintroduced to a sort of smell even many years later, it's like a triggered response, and we can have a very kind of vivid sort of picture of when we first experienced that particular odour. And just talk a bit more about the odours things is that in those days, if you wanted freshly ground coffee, it was a rarity to find that really in the UK, and so you had to go to a special coffee shop. There were not so many of them around, where you know, you'd sort of sit in there as a child and sort of whilst the person would actually put sort of beans from all these massive kind of array of different beans from around the world into a special machine, and, you know, sort of so many minutes later the coffee would be ground and a little packet for you to take home. And it was just that beautiful smell there. It's just a very kind of like vivid memories for me, really. And so, yeah, I think, as I said, it planted a seed in my mind that might be interesting to look at.
What comes first? Is it the smell or the thought? When you have a memory of something, does the smell come to you first and then the image comes in your mind, or do you know that process yet? Yeah,
well, I think it's very difficult for anybody to recreate the odour in their mind. You know, that's something we find incredibly difficult as humans, whereas you think of other modalities, other senses, that is, such as like vision or hearing, we can almost recreate that sound, say, of a famous Beatles song in our mind, you know, sort of famous picture, Van Gogh Sunflowers or something like that. We can do that quite well, but for an odour, it's extremely difficult. Even if you expand that to the taste, say, I don't know, fresh ripe strawberry. I do this like in-class test every year with my students, and hardly anyone finds that sort of, you know, as vivid and powerful as sort of like, you know, vision or sort of sound memories. So it is incredibly difficult. But that's the kind of paradox in a way, because when we're reintroduced to an odour and it's actually present, then it can trigger these very profound responses that are far more powerful than these other senses, which is interesting.
Yeah. It's like if you walk past something in the street and suddenly, you know, maybe someone's wearing an aftershave or a perfume that you recognise, it, you immediately get taken back to that point in time where you first smelt it.
Yeah.
And I think, to be honest, I actually think now recently coffee's the number one drink for people in the UK over tea. I read a story about that, so it's taking over. And you have done research on coffee specifically. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I was doing my PhD many years ago at Sussex, that was to do with studying caffeine rather than just sort of odours and things like that. And we were interested in sort of, why people choose to consume caffeinated beverages. Does it actually sort of enhance their sort of like cognition and alertness and that sort of thing? And then latterly I got sort of taking a slightly different sort of like point, and I looked at the influence of odours as well in that kind of process. That didn't really show anything that clear at that time. But then a few years later when I arrived at Portsmouth, I wanted to look at this a bit further. And so, yeah, we've done a variety of like studies in terms of odours. And so we've shown that, because it's a mildly addictive drug then caffeine, and people who consume coffee, obviously there's more caffeine in coffee than tea, for instance. And we showed that individuals that are habitual consumers of coffee, they can detect the odour of coffee at much lower concentrations compared to people that are not coffee consumers. And whereas in a kind of neutral odour, there's no difference. So it did seem to be, specific to the odour of coffee, which was kind of cool in a way, because it kind of leads into some of the research in terms of addiction for other types of drugs. And the importance of the sensory aspect. We might think of alcohol, we might think of other kinds of drugs that we ingest as well. And interestingly, when I was collecting data for that former study, speaking to somebody there who worked with people who were recovering alcoholics, told me a story which I found very, very interesting. I tried to use it in one of my articles, but it didn't quite fit in. But basically, they were working with recovering alcoholics and in a kind of residential setting, and they'd ordered some sort of Christmas puddings, which normally have alcohol in them, but they made a point of requesting the non-alcohol versions of these Christmas puddings. And when they arrived, they put them in the oven, and the puddings were cooking away nicely. And a lot of the addicts, recovering addicts, were getting very agitated, whilst this food was cooking. And then when the people who were working at the actual place, they checked the actual packet, they were the alcoholic version. So presumably, we can't be certain, of course, but presumably they were smelling something in the alcohol that cooking there with the Christmas pudding, and that's what was setting them on edge. Now, obviously, one could say, well, it might not necessarily be that. It might just be the general association of like Christmas puddings, right? So, but it's interesting nonetheless in terms of that anecdotal evidence.
And that potential role that smells have with, in correlation with addiction, it's not really an area that's been massively explored in research. And you think it would be, especially because of, the focus on addiction and reducing pressure on the NHS. Why is that?
Yeah, I think it perhaps just sort of typifies something else that we've noticed in the sort of the olfactory field, that it's a very small field. For instance, in this country, in terms of the psychology and the biological kind of link, those two nexus, there are not many people doing that kind of research. And I think in the addiction field, that kind of it sort of typifies that as well. So, for instance, a lot of research has been done on the visual side of it, which is undoubtedly important, because one of the theories of addiction is that, you get conditioned to actually have a response to drug cues, such as the packet of cigarettes or the logo of cigarettes if you're a smoker. It might be a beer bottle or brand if you're into alcohol. And so just the sight of those things alone can trigger craving in somebody who's addicted to it. So vision undoubtedly plays a sort of part in it as well. But it's only more recently, we're looking at other kind of sensory cues as well to sort of see how the importance they may play. Yeah.
And it's also interesting the language that we use to describe smells, because when you're talking about something that you come across, it might smell sweet, but sweet is actually a term used for the taste or the flavour of something. So it's almost as if smells doesn't have its own language. Why is that, and what can potentially be introduced in order to help that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, for people who may be sommeliers into their wines, or sort of, tea tasters or whatever, they may well have, and they do have, or perfumers have their own language that they use to describe certain kinds of smells in terms of notes or what have you. But for the everyday person, there just isn't the language there for kind of smells to almost put a handle on the different kind of qualities of odours or what have you. And I think that's, there's one of the theories that we can't abstract odors, whereas we can for sounds and sort of, vision as well. So that means to say we can't compartmentalize an odor in our mind for the reasons we just spoke about. You can't recreate that in your mind so easily. We can't move around that mental space with an odor so easily. So probably that's why we don't have these kind of descriptors. And actually, we often get it wrong. So you talked about sort of sweetness there, and quite rightly, people often do describe that. That's a lovely sweet smell that somebody, might, detect in their environment. But there are no olfactory receptors for sweetness. So what they're really describing is the taste of that food in their mouth then. Okay, so they're kind of misattributing it to smell when it's really to do with flavor. So anything inside our mouth is to do with flavor. Anything outside the mouth is something different then. So, and taste, we like to kind of separate that into the sense of gustation in terms of sweet, sour, bitter, umami, what have you, that sort of thing.
And is it possible as well, the reason why we haven't really, come up with a language, or we don't tend to talk about smells in the same way we do about taste or vision, etc., because of the connotations of smells and our attitudes towards it?
I think so, quite possibly. It could be cultural, I think, as well. It's often sort of thought of as reminders of our animal past, our sense of smell. And, if you think about, growing up in sort of schools, there's sort of, different sort of school smells, and it's quite a kind of jokey type thing, really. So I think maybe for that reason, people don't take it so seriously. But I think it's fascinating. I remember speaking to school teachers over the years, and they seem to think that, that some of the kids at school can actually identify different children by the smell of their coats in their little cloakroom, which I found fascinating. But I could quite believe that might be the case as well. So it's an interesting area then.
I remember when I was at school, when I was younger, I could identify family members or friends based on, just smelling material that they'd worn, which is, but I definitely can't do that now. I don't know if that's, like you said, if it's something that maybe we lose as we get older and our ability to smell weakens. Is that something about aging?
Well, it does, but more sort of not at your age, more at my age, sort of over 50. So your sense of smell definitely declines, I think. So sort of that's quite a well-known curve. But, not for everybody. Some people still have very kind of acute sense of smell at such an age. But it's interesting talking about the other end at the children's age as well, because, even in sort of newly born sort of infants, they've done some research in presenting them with different kinds of smells, and to see how their facial kind of responses react, because obviously they don't have language at such a young age. And so they've shown them or presented sort of odours which are, really quite unpleasant, like sort of something like, butter or smelly feet, butter that's gone off kind of, or smelly feet or whatever, and looked at their facial responses and compared that to things like formula milk and vanilla, which is really, really interesting, because whilst the facial responses for these unpleasant odours seem to be generally more unpleasant and what we might sort of think of as like a prototypical disgust response, but that's by no means, for all babies, but that's generally the trend is there. Whereas for the odour of vanilla, for instance, is much more mixed. And so that sort of shows quite clearly that that's a learned response, because as adults, we can't get enough of the smell of vanilla. We absolutely love it. So that seems to sort of show the fact that, we learn to respond to the odour of vanilla because of many pairings of the sweet taste of, say, chocolate or ice cream in our mouth, and we've associated it to the odour of vanilla, so that when we just smell the odour of vanilla, that kind of in the same way as the alcoholics, that triggers craving for the chocolate or whatever, and so it has that response.
But it's memories, isn't it? It's treats. It's what we're brought up to say, if you're good, you'll get a treat. And I imagine there's quite a lot of parents now that are trying to do slightly differently and maybe not associate sugar with treats. And we said there, obviously, they're an age factor. You may lose your sense of smell, or it would weaken over time. But at COVID, that was quite an interesting part, because it really put smells at the forefront of the discussion, because a lot of people lost that.
Yeah, it's right on cue there, because I've been to a conference recently that was staged by Fifth Sense, a charity that help people who've lost their sense of smell and taste, and even they admit themselves that sort of the main person in charge there of Fifth Sense, that COVID in a cruel way has been a great ambassador for the charity and for raising the awareness of people who are living without smell and taste. Because they reckon about 5% of any population, functionally anosmic. They can't smell, that means. And that's been exacerbated by COVID. And that's really shone a light on, difficulties of living without this sort of sense of smell. And, it doesn't just come down to like loss of sense of, flavour for food. Obviously, there are risks in terms of not being able to detect gas and smoke, fire hazards, food that's unsafe to eat. And there's lots of other things as well, such as a social connection. People kind of lose that kind of bond between other people, particularly maybe if they have children and sort of like used to actually, smelling their children and sort of that kind of, a closer bond that people have. So they lose all of that. Yeah.
And what does losing the sense of smell, how does that affect things like your appetite or, you'd imagine if you lost your sense of smell, food wouldn't taste as good. So your immediate thought would be, that people wouldn't eat as much. Is that the case?
It does happen with some people, and it's kind of annoyingly, it's not clear cut. So you get sort of maybe roughly half people that might lose their appetite and potentially lose weight because, as you said, they lose interest in the sort of the flavour of food that they're not getting. But you also get another sort of like half of people where, because they're not getting enough pleasure from the food they're eating, they're not getting that kind of pleasure hit. So then they're actually eating more to compensate, to get derive some pleasure, and then that can lead to weight gain. Interestingly, there's some evidence that that's more the case of people who lose their sense of smell at a younger age. So maybe something about being more active, so they have an appetite, and maybe something interaction with the pleasure centers of their brain. They're kind of eating more to compensate. Yeah.
So it's obviously we're in the new year. Loads of people have some New Year resolutions of trying to cut out things like coffee or chocolate, or maybe the things that they associate with fun. What advice would you have to them in order to kind of cut back and stick to those resolutions?
Well, it's a difficult one, that one. I never like to give out sort of, too much advice really, because there's so much grey area really in here. But I guess if you're really kind of, worried about something and, you could try to associate particular food with an unpleasant response. And if you did that enough, then, surely enough, the odour would be an unpleasant response. But I think that would be a little bit cruel, really. And I think, it might be boring to say this, but I think moderation is perhaps the best sort of advice there in these things.
Don't keep it in your house, because the smell will just, or if you've got a partner, maybe try and encourage them, I suppose, to also cut it out for the month so that you don't have that smell in the morning of waking up to the smell of fresh coffee. Or when you go out, just steer clear of any of the coffee shops or any of the chocolate shops. I can imagine that's good. So back to the research side of things. Why should we take smell more seriously? We've spoken quite lightheartedly about some of the fun connotations of smells and things like that. We did mention addiction, which obviously is a really key talking point. But what is it about today that we really need to maybe pay attention a bit more to smells?
Well, I think it does go below the radar quite a lot, really. And nobody's going to argue that, say, losing your sense of smell is more important than, say, losing vision or audition. But nevertheless, it is a key sort of sense, and it's not sort of thought of, in those terms really. So, research is sort of growing all the time, and so we know that if individuals lose their sense of smell suddenly, that can be an early sort of warning for things like Parkinson's disease or maybe other types of neurological disease. So there are sort of serious parts of it as well. We've spoken a bit about if you lose your sense of smell, that actually carries risks with it. So I think it's very important sense and it shouldn't be underrated. And just generally in kind of interaction with people, it does play an important part. And, I guess, there's things like the cosmetics industry that, kind of play on those sort of aspects as well. But and it's sort of it's one of those areas of research that even the basic biology isn't sort of pinned down completely yet, and that's what makes it an exciting field for researchers to work in. Even in terms of basic discrimination of different types of odors, how is it actually done? So we know parts about how sort of the olfactory system sort of processes odors up until the higher parts of the brain. But there is where the mystery sort of only starts really. So that's what makes it interesting from a researcher's point of view, and these interactions with other areas of behaviour as well.
You mentioned the cosmetics industry. I also think about the food industry and how they've clocked on to how smell can really help sell something, draw in customers. But now you're looking at markets like, for instance, smoking. Smell of smoke has always been a put off for a lot of people anyway, and yet they're now manufacturing vape, which is all based around something that smells more pleasant. So that's kind of a sort of a dangerous steer for that industry. They're saying obviously it's to help, but it's attracting a new audience completely.
It is a difficult area, that one, and I think the UK is sort of taken a different view to other countries, and you can see why, we may have done that in terms of people who are existing tobacco smokers. You want them to come off tobacco, of course, everybody gets that. And so maybe using vapes might be one way they can do that. But as you're suggesting, one of the concerns is in so doing, you're attracting people that never smoked before, because it's looked as a cool thing to do. And, you have this, instrument in your hand that's kind of like, emitting sort of large plumes of smoke, which smell nice. And if you're using like sweet sort of flavors, as I say, again, misusing the word there in terms of smell, but, that might attract sort of younger users, which is definitely a cause for concern, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It's been absolutely fascinating. And as we've heard, sense of smell is often underestimated when it's up against the likes of taste, sight and sound. But not only does our nose combine with our other senses to give us a full picture of the world, it can also be doing a lot of things in our unconscious that we don't even know about. Perhaps it's time to take another look or sniff of the powers of smells. If you'd like to listen to our full episode of Life Solved, exploring the science of smells, head to the University of Portsmouth website or download it on your favourite podcast app now. You can click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research to find out more about the Department of Psychology, which is where we're actually filming today. In a couple of weeks, we'll be taking a look at the cost of living crisis. And as the post-Christmas bills start coming in, money will likely be on many of our minds. See you then.